and in a sense not knowing. It's a sort of non-worry situation. Just get on with it. Just get on with it and do it. And if you do it right, then there will be no question about its status. The people of 1946 at Britain can make it. The people at the festival were looking over their shoulders at the rest of the world, making sure that they were being eccentric enough to be British, making sure that they were being modern enough to be worth noticed, and so on. But not the kind of people who come through from Colin Rowe and after. That whole generation didn't bother, didn't worry. They knew they were all right. They just got on with it like that. It applies not just to the Smithsons, it applies to Jimmy Sterling, Jimmy Gowan, Sandy Wilson, you know us, my lot, probably me too, arrogant bastards. No other word for it, you know. We came here to make our mark on the world, pushing, kicking, elbowing and shoving, and we got there. We were the generation that made This Is Tomorrow in 1956, and we really were very much of a generation. And we were mostly Brits. There were very few father figures among us, and there were very few non-British born among us. In fact, if you eliminate Goldfinger, you get rid of most of both categories fairly effectively from the cast list of This Is Tomorrow. So short on father figures, short on foreigners. More important, I think, This Is Tomorrow was a conscious rejection of provincial status. The preliminary meetings that led up to This Is Tomorrow were not organised by the independent group, forget all that mythology. They were organised by a lady called Paul Vézelay, who came over from Paris, to start here a local branch of her movement, La Groupe Espace. But when the assembled Brit talent got together at those meetings and took stock of its own strength and depth and variety, they soon decided they could manage quite well without La Vézelay. And they did, you know. I mean, they pretty well told her to get lost. And just, you know, she wasn't. I mean, they said, right, let's have an exhibition. Let's do a big thing all together. Bye bye, au revoir, and got on with it. And there was, I remember at the time, a very distinct mood, you know, that we knew. I was a bit fringe to this operation, but I was privy to some of the meetings. That we knew that we could do it. We could do the sort of things that Paul Vézelay had been talking about, the integration of architecture and abstract art and all that kind of thing. We could do a whole lot of other things as well, and we were going to do all those things. And all those things did, in fact, genuinely happen at This Is Tomorrow. When it finally went public down there at Whitechapel Gallery 20 years ago, almost to the day from now, there was plenty there that the systematic constructionists and integrationists of the art could recognize as their own, and there was plenty there which was not. There are many other very weird and strange things which I won't pursue all over the place tonight because there's something else I want to pursue. But the whole range was there. It is unfortunate that because history is written by the victors and not by the vanquished, and because pop art was the emergent or about to become the emergent of the time, and the abstract integration of the arts was just about on its last legs at that moment, that This Is Tomorrow is remembered as a pop art exhibition. But in fact, only very small segments were, by any stretch of the imagination, to be called pop art. It was an exhibition of great variety, of great depth, of great silliness, of great profundity. Everything happened there, all the things you would expect. A bunch of people collected up ad hoc, broken up into groups in a pretty ad hoc manner. We were clumped, with the word of the time, more or less forcibly. Every group had to have an architect, a painter and a sculptor and anybody else who liked to hang on. And for one incredible evening we sort of stood around picking up sides, like playing Reliso at school. You know, like, I'll swap you 2 architects for 1 sculptor. Can I have it? No, I can't. You can't have Eduardo Palazzi. He's already booked, kind of thing, you know. But we'll offer you, we'll offer you one of the Martin family instead. Didn't get quite as bad as that, but it wasn't far off at times. And many of the groupings were, in fact, very ad hoc and very surprising. And it accounts for some of the ad hoc and surprising things that finally happened. And this excessively fine focus there always tends to be historically nowadays on This Is Tomorrow as a pop art show, first of all, disguises all that kind of thing. And secondly, it also confuses and obscures some other very important things that happened in that same year. Now, I think there are a number of ways that one could have identified the happening of those happenings. I am going to do it tonight by comparing and contrasting, like it says in art history examination papers, by comparing and contrasting two two performed Smithson projects of that year. And the Smithsons present will probably disagree with my estimate of what actually happened inside them. But I hope they'll take my main point about the significance of those two things. The other reason for wanting to make this particular comparison is it enables me to show you some slides which aren't very often seen in public, which I think will just about blow the eyelids off some of you who've never seen them before. Now, if the camera crew are ready, we'll do the lights out routine, though absolutely nothing will happen that you can notice much, because all the lights are on already and are going to stay on as far as I know. And then we will launch into the next batch of slides. A quick slurp. Okay. Right. Right? Okay. You're all movie stars for a night. Okay. At the Ideal Home exhibition, not something that normally figures largely in the history of architecture, at the Ideal Home exhibition of 1956, the Smithsons showed their House of the Future. Its importance, irrespective of the architectural quality, is that it may have a stronger claim than anything at This Is Tomorrow to have been the first true product of all the pop art studies that have been going on for so long. It was different from Edoardo Paolozzi's work in tone and style. It was earlier than any of the pop paintings of Richard Hamilton. And it was different from both, and it was addressed to a pop audience, not to a bunch of gallery sophisticates. I think this is very important. What it offered was a standard habitable capsule, to use a word of 10 years later. Standard habitable capsule, handed in pairs, left and right, so they could be put together, I suppose, as traditional British semi-debts, but more important, set up in long rows, which seemed to have been the approved planning procedure of the time. It had no windows on the outside, but was entered by a very stylish door, complete with attached technology, as you can see it here. A door and styling not unlike the styling of cars of the period. Can't hammer this point too hard, but nevertheless, there's a background of close observation of automotive technology goes into this. And not only that, but in its interior as well, it came with all its parts and options already installed and already designed in like a car, and with a system of panelled construction, which again is difficult not to relate to automotive technology. Not only the panel construction, but the way the bits and pieces were designed in as well, in a way which in fact was uncommon in both British architecture and British cars at that time. And in the kitchen, again, as in cars of the time, there are quotations of wood graining, like on station wagons of the period, and large areas of shiny chromium on the handles and so forth, again recalling the detailing of automotive technology at that time. It was, in the precise sense in which we used to use the word in those days, fabulous. That was a very precise adjective of the period, and this was exactly fabulous. Put together by the Smithsons with an extraordinary sureness of touch and with an extraordinary sure understanding of what its destination was. A mass market product addressed to a mass audience, not to a gallery coterie, and therefore treated to a certain extent as styling rather than as art. Consumer products of the period were styled. This too, the House of the Future, would be styled. It has many other things as well, but it was certainly that. Indeed, the only thing which went wrong with the House of the Future was those parts of it for which the Smithsons really were not truly responsible, such as the garments worn by the persons of the future who inhabited it, done by a famous fashion designer of the period who clearly had no idea what it was really all about. Had it been 10 years later, had Mary Quant been available, had Courage been available, the thing would have been properly dressed in its own proper style. But they weren't around at the time. It took the rag trade lark another 10 years to catch up with what had been going on there in 1956. And that had been an extremely busy and action-packed decade. Later in the same year, at Whitechapel, the Smithsons, together with Paolozzi and Nigel Henderson, were to find themselves addressing friends and gallery sophisticates. This is very much, as it were, the art community talking to one another. And they responded accordingly with an interior, a pavilion in a patio, which makes for strangely elusive, oblique photographs, because they are in fact all reflected in the aluminium sheet sidewalls which went round the patio. It has, you know, the surviving photographic evidence has precisely the kind of right fine art quality. Makes it difficult to read at one level, easy enough to read at a different level, at a purely superficial level, as a kind of celebration of garden shed civilization or garden shed aesthetics. A backyard full of tatty old family miracles, but enclosed by a sand garden, I think is the right way to put it, in which were inexplicably and unexplainedly laid out things, objects, images, shards of real and imaginary civilizations dredged up from the subconscious of Edoardo Paolozzi, Nigel Henderson, or I don't know, the Smithsons themselves. A kind of personal archaeology which you just had to stand and look at and try and make best sense of you could. It did not straight out explain itself like the House of the Future. You needed to know something of what all this was about. And all enclosed in this strange circumvallation of reflecting surfaces in which everything was doubled, in which corners disappeared, in which you yourself appeared, as it were, redrawn by Edoardo Paolozzi, or as photographed underwater or something by Nigel Henderson. It was a strange, moving, and very, very fine art experience. Totally different to the other thing. Now, it is clear that ultimately this really, the route through fine art and traditional architecture was, or traditional modern architecture, was the route that the Smithsons were to prefer to pursue. The House of the Future thing, to use a 1976 phrase, was, I think, for them an alternative scenario. Maybe an important alternative scenario, but only an alternative scenario. But of course there was a generation coming for whom it would be the scenario. And there are some extraordinary pre-echoes, and I'll say no more than that, of what was to come later in the House of the Future particularly. That's the bath in the House of the Future, with all its nice jointing and its free-form shapes. And if it looks sort of familiar, then this is the gasket housing of Archigram of 1964. Now, I'm not saying there are direct connections. I leave that to other people in this house. Kenneth Frampton will prove it. Charlie Jenks will disprove it in due course. But it's all, you know, the potential is there. All I'm saying is that the Smithsons, with their alternative scenario, rewrote the scenario for half the British modern movement after that. Okay, pause. That's it for camera. Okay? And that, in fact, is the end of the slides. So now we'll get on to the rest of the chat and the restoration of normal environmental conditions in here. As I say, for the Smithsons, an alternative scenario. For the rest of the British modern movement, I think the scenario for the next 10 years. In those snubbed corners, rounded shapes, sharp colours, etc., of the house of the future, I think one can now begin to see coming on pretty...
Does that mean we can have this third-degree light on?
In 3 minutes.
about as long as it takes to unship it. And it's only me that's getting a third-degree, Buster, and I'm suffering the Gestapo treatment. You're all right down the back there, mate. However, let us restore good humour and proceed. But when I sweat for the public good, boy, the public gets to know about it. Oh yes, alternative traditions. But to me, the making of the choice between the two traditions is probably what's the most important thing about it. Because it was a kind of choice which I think could only be made by people who knew that they were somehow in the big league and somehow in world class. Whether they knew it right or knew it wrong is not here the point at issue. It is just the sense that these choices were important. These choices were made at the level of what was important in the rest of the world, not what was important simply to the Brits or what was important to the British view of modern architecture or something like that. This stuff, I think, was done. These decisions were made, as I say, at, in some sense, a world level. One had the sense at the time that these were important developments. And looking back, I think history still supports that idea. Many funny things have happened to architecture since, and many tragically unfunny things. But there is a parting of the ways there between what I would call that branch of British modern, which stands on the traditions of the modern movement, and therefore on the traditions of architecture generally, so that Alice and Smithson, for instance, can trace the origins, the background of the Free University at Berlin back to the pavilions of Fatehpur Sikri. There's that tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, the tradition of the smooth, the rounded cornered, the high technology, etc., etc. But, as I say, decisions made consciously at a world level. What is interesting now to speculate, and one can only speculate really, is to what extent the world dominance, and there certainly was world dominance of the other tradition, the pop or archigram tradition, after the middle of the 60s, to what extent that was due not just to architectural quality and architectural causes, but to it being overrun from behind by a whole wave of other pop developments among the Brits. These increasing senses of international self-confidence and so on among the architects did not happen only among the architects. In a sense, we were all in this. The historians of culture have not yet come to terms with the Beatles or with Mary Quant, but one can't not mention them in this particular context. They were proof that it was all happening in England, and therefore they were proof to some extent that what was happening in English architecture was important. And they were convincing proof. There's something very odd here, which I think a historian of art, design, culture, etc. has to think about pretty carefully, which is this, that all that swinging London stuff, all those miniskirts and microskirts and all those dolly girls and so on, are seen by the world as something entirely British, invented in Carnaby Street, no doubt. But in fact, the first miniskirt I can remember, and she showed me, but never mind why, had a courage label in the back of it. And as far as I can remember, on strict historical ground, the miniskirt comes from Paris, but not from London. But by the middle of the 60s, nobody could believe that. By the middle of the 60s, if it was happening, it had to come from England. It's a thought that it didn't come from Paris. The deprovincialisation, if that's the word, of English culture was almost happening so fast that people weren't paying attention to what was really going on at the time. It's very odd, thinking back, that I do not remember. Now, right, everybody's memory is fallible, particularly about things like this, particularly on hot weather like this. I do not remember the name of Le Corbusier being mentioned at Folkestone. Maybe I was there on the wrong day. I don't know. I remember lots of other things and lots of other names being mentioned, Buckminster Fuller at great length. I don't remember the name of Le Corbusier being mentioned. He died less than 12 months before, but no, gone, forgotten apparently, lost in the rush away from Paris, which was rapidly ceasing to be the art capital, the culture capital of the world, to, as we now see perhaps, a mythical Britain, but certainly to Britain. This maybe was distant early warning of what is really an almost incredible situation at the Centre Pompidou 10 years after Folkestone. That's a building in Paris. Nevertheless, the design was put out to international competition. What happened to French self-confidence? It was won by an Anglo-Italian team. What happened to French chauvinism? It had British engineers. What happened to the École Polytechnique? The winning design is actually built as designed. What happened to French bureaucratic interference? Well, a bit got in, but surprisingly little. As I said at the beginning of the talk, it's fantastic how near the original scheme what is actually being built really is. Almost the only thing, as I say, which has been altered is that business of the colour and the because of a presidential interference. Pretty well everything else, apart from a small brawl with the fire chiefs, they got away with. So that looking back over these 10 years, we see what, in a mood of unfashionable jingoism, one could see the decades of rising British ascendancy in avant-garde modern architecture. But I don't want to pitch it like that. I'd much rather see it that in those 10 years, the British, rather more successfully than joining the European common market, have joined the worldwide modern movement as respectable equals, as contributors, as part of the cutting edge of that movement. And one can see in 10-year steps from Nicholas Pevsner's first 1936 reminders that we once had a place to where we are now. One can see in 10-year steps this process happening. And although this was not in my mind when I first suggested to Peter Cook that we should celebrate This Is Tomorrow and Folkestone here sometime this summer, this has been increasingly borne in on me. When I started to look at what has actually happened, more and more I could see this particular pattern emerging. But is it a pattern? To what extent are these decades accidents, mere sort of markers in a process which was going on much more slowly? It didn't feel like that at the time. This Is Tomorrow felt tremendously important. Folkestone certainly felt tremendously important. I mean, the atmosphere in all senses at Folkestone at the end of the last day was, it was the first mass trip I was ever on. And there was hardly a weed in the house, as far as I can remember. But everything was right off the ground and going. You know, I think this was, in a sense, maybe the first whisper of the Woodstock Nation situation. All us square old architects, you know, and architectural historians, and Michael Cousteau, you'd never believe the people who were there at the time, you know. And by the end of the last day, we were absolutely in orbit. No other word for it. You know, I mean, it felt incredibly important at the time. Nevertheless, one has to admit that there is one authority on the structure of time in the history of art. His book, The Shape of Time, this is George Kubler, grand old American historian of primarily Latin American and pre-Columbian art. His book, The Shape of Time, is almost the only work we have which you might say is about chronological structuralism or something like that. And in it, he says absolutely flatly and straightforwardly about decades, the decade is only a decimal position in the century. Only a decimal position in the century. Both the decade and the century are arbitrary intervals rather than working durations. There is nothing in the history of art corresponding either to a century or to its 10th part. That's pretty straight stuff, say, from the master of chronological structuralism. I don't happen to believe it. I think what I've been talking about this evening suggests there is, in fact, at least in the recent history of British art and architecture, a very clear 10-year structure. On the other hand, if what I say is true overall, and that we have ceased to be provincial, we have joined the worldwide modern movement, we have become part of the cutting edge, we can now speak to the great architects, designers, painters, etc. of other countries as equals, then if all that is true, I know how I have simply to withdraw everything I said, because now that we are all these things, we have to take damn foreigners like George Kubler seriously. Thank you very much. Is anybody going to open a door or anything? Open some doors at the back, please. If you can, that is.
Last time they came to London.